Kia ora, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Ka bari koutaho kore karahi mo te putea whai whakaro. No mai haere mai ki tēnei hui mariko. No mai haere mai whakawhiki mai. So welcome everybody. I'm very happy to see you all. I'm Barry Coates. I'm the founder and CEO of Mindful Money. I'm joined in the background with my fabulous colleague Olive, who may well come up on screen at some stage. But thanks very much for tuning into this session. So we're going to talk about investment and how it can be a force for good on climate change. And by investment, we mean KiwiSaver, if you've got any investment funds, etc. And by being a force for good on climate change, we're talking about how you can avoid being part of the problem, which is the situation for most people who have those investments, and instead to be able to influence your money to do good. So I've got some PowerPoint slides to show you. We will run through those and then have plenty of time for questions. But in the meantime, feel free at any stage to put any questions, comments, thoughts into the Ask a Question button. And I'll address those as we go along or in the Q&A session at the end. So I will kick off with this presentation. Let me just make sure it works. So here we go. Now, I'm hoping that everyone can see this. Good. So, welcome again. Let's go to the next slide. Why are we doing this? Why is this important? Well, one of the issues for climate change is that those on the front lines of climate change are the ones who are suffering most. And we see pictures of kind of flooded towns in New Zealand, but actually the worst of the impacts are felt in the tropics, and they're felt by communities who have no way to defend themselves. They've got no social welfare system. They've got no state who can help protect them or help them with recovery. They've got no insurance policies. And this is the situation that we all ought to be aware of and concerned about, as well as, of course, as being concerned about what's happening in New Zealand. So for these people, they did very little to cause the problem. And that's the injustice of climate change. The people on the front lines are those who did little to be part of creating this problem with our greenhouse gases. And climate change is part of a broader agenda for change. I really like the thinking that's gone in behind the Sustainable Development Goals. I've been involved in this kind of in a previous career when I was head of Oxfam for a decade. And these interconnected issues are a way to look more holistically at the climate change problem, to recognize that issues of a just transition, issues of other aspects of poverty and sustainability need to be addressed alongside climate change. So, for example, we are going through a massive extinction of biodiversity in our time. So as we're taking action on climate change, we need to be aware of that. We're living in a time of extreme inequality. We need to be aware of the just transition issues. So this is a call for a broader framework in thinking about climate action. So let's turn to the role of finance. This is my favorite cartoon of all time. And I think it says a lot about our finance system. So these people are in a post-apocalyptic era, similar to many of the videos and episodes you see these days. Um, and the guy who possibly was a previous banker or finance guy said, yes, the planet got destroyed. But for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. And that's the problem, that the finance system has put the value for shareholders of financial returns above all else, to the point that if you look at your KiwiSaver or your investment funds and you say, so what's the impact of my money that's invested? Literally, the people who manage your money can't tell you. And until Mindful Money started up, there was no way that you could find out which companies your money was invested in a way that encompassed the whole portfolio and enabled you to make sense of it. So that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a finance system and a way of thinking that assumed that financial return was the only thing that mattered, and it didn't matter what the impact of money was. And that's how we got into the mess that we're in. But, members of the public get this. They want to do something different. So we do annual surveys of the New Zealand public around their issues towards their attitudes towards ethical investment. And this is the one that answers the question of do you expect your KiwiSaver funds and other investments to be invested responsibly and ethically? And 76% of people agree. So that's over 3/4. And that's really important because I think as we go through this presentation, you'll find out that that isn't always the case. And that very often the managers of our money don't invest our funds responsibly and ethically, and certainly not at the standards that people would expect. By the way, we've got another version of this annual survey coming out in a couple of weeks' time. Details on Mindful Money's website. So this is kind of stepping back a little bit, but I just want to say, so if you want to manage your funds ethically, then this is kind of a way to help you understand how you can do this. And excuse me for getting a little bit complicated in this, but actually it's kind of important for really understanding what the leverage points are so that you can become a more informed investor. So on the left-hand side, you've got traditional funds. Those are the guys sitting in the cave and they ignore the impact on environment and society from their investments. That still, sadly, is most of the finance sector. Then on the next box, you've got avoiding harm. And that's where a fund will screen out the sectors or practices that cause social or environmental harm. And it's like fossil fuel companies or companies that violate human rights or test their products on animals or buy weapons or rather invest in weapons makers. So that's the ways you can invest to avoid harm. And now there's a number of funds that you can invest in KiwiSaver and your investment funds that will avoid harm. Then you go to the yellow box, the engage. And this is a strategy where the people who invest in the companies and engage with those companies to improve their performance. And that engagement is like the New Zealand Superannuation Fund engaged with Facebook and other social media providers in the wake of the Christchurch terrorist shooting. So they basically were saying, we as an investor are invested in companies like Facebook, and we need to exercise our influence as people who own their shares in order to raise their standards. And it's an interesting case because they managed to make a little bit of change, but not as much as they had hoped. And they did an evaluation of what they tried to do, which is a good thing to do. As you go along kind of towards the green end of the spectrum, you get to better standards. And this is where the funds target some of their investment into businesses that have higher standards, or that invest in companies that do good, in companies that might be renewable energy producers, or produce organics, or invest in affordable housing, etc. And then right on the right-hand side in the dark green, you've got impact investing, which is where a complete fund, a kind of a whole lot of companies are all companies that are undertaking their business or their social enterprise for purposes that create public good. So again, that's in kind of renewable energy and social housing and other aspects. So this is a kind of what we call the spectrum of investment impact. This is a way to understand how your fund can go from creating harm on the left-hand side to avoiding harm, improving companies, investing some of the money in better companies, and into investing all of the money in better companies. So it's a useful way to understand investment impact. So these are I'll go through these issues. So the first one on avoiding harm, this is from the same annual survey we did. These are some of the issues that people want to avoid. And if you start reading from the top, and sorry that the typeface is a bit small, but at the top it says that the number one thing that people want to avoid is labor rights abuses, sweatshop labor, child labor, etc. 91% of New Zealanders want to avoid those things. Just below that is other human rights violations. Then environmental degradation. So you can see that these are all kind of around 90% of people want to avoid these things. Further down, you've got some issues about social media companies. You've got testing animals for non-medical purposes. You've got weapons and firearms, gambling, etc. And you've got fossil fuels in there. And for example, on fossil fuels, it's about 3/4 of the public want to avoid fossil fuels. So these are the kind of things that now you can get funds that avoid many of these things in their investment. And so that's some progress towards kind of being able to avoid harm. However, we still have a huge amount of money in KiwiSaver funds that are invested in these things. And the biggest of the lot is animal testing. And Mindful Money just did an online seminar on investment in companies that test their products on animals. And it was really interesting to hear about some of the particularly egregious forms of animal testing. And it involves some of the biggest cosmetic brands, for example. And that amounts to $2.3 billion in KiwiSaver funds. And then you've got down the bottom fossil fuels, which is 1.5 billion. You've got companies that violate human rights or abuse the environment at over $1 billion, etc. on the other things. So although there's some work to avoid concerns, actually a lot of KiwiSaver funds, over 7%, still goes into these areas that members of the public are deeply concerned about. A second thing that chart, that spectrum showed, was that funds can engage with companies to improve their practices. And this is the story of ExxonMobil, which was once the world's biggest company. And it was a leader in oil and gas. And just recently, because Exxon hasn't changed their basic business model, and they're still doubling down to invest in fossil fuels. They're still paying money to climate deniers. They're still involved in lobbying against climate regulation with the US government. A bunch of major institutional shareholders, including the funds that have our money, um, they basically ganged up on Exxon at their annual general meeting, and they passed what was called a shareholder resolution against Exxon, and they forced 3 Exxon directors out and replaced them with investors, with directors who were more friendly towards Exxon transitioning towards being a clean energy company. So it was an example of the fact that you can have these shareholder actions, which actually will be able to influence even huge companies in order to take action. The thing is, it doesn't happen all the time, and it happens very, very slowly. So don't go out and buy Exxon shares, because they're still a company that is completely wedded to a fossil fuel model, but the process of change has started. So that's an example of where engagement can make a difference. And the third area that we said is that funds can put their money into things that people want, like social housing, like renewable energy, and like communities. And that's really where I think many of us see as the kind of the promise of saying we're actually going to be able to shift money in our economy from things that do harm into things that can have a positive impact in our society. And that's absolutely at the heart of Mindful Money's mission. We're a charity, and that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to shift money into things that make a positive difference. So in the climate change sphere, we've also been trying to get the major funds who hold our KiwiSaver accounts or hold our investment funds to commit to going to zero in the companies in their funds. So, as you know, kind of if you're a fund manager, you may have 50 companies that you invest in. You may have 100. You may have 5,000. And very much kind of in finance theory, it's good to have a lot of companies, because that's the way to diversify your risk. So what we're saying in net zero is that across all of those companies, we want the net total of the emissions across all of those companies to be net zero. And that means that firstly, the fund managers have to drive emissions down as fast as possible. So now, internationally, if you remember last December around COP26, there was a whole flood of these funds who said, oh yes, we'll go to net zero. And the total was astronomical. It's now US $130 trillion that have pledged to net zero. That's $130 trillion of funds under management. And by the way, trillion is 12 zeros. So it's a very, very big number. And $130 trillion is probably over half of the world's funds under management. So it's really significant. It includes a few New Zealand funds. At that time, it was the Crown Financial Institution. So that's New Zealand Superannuation Fund and the Accident Compensation Commission, for example, and then some banks and other funds. So BT Westpac, Mercer, Pathfinder, Russell, and an insurance company called QBE, and subsequently BNZ has joined that, and Kiwi Bank. So now a coalition has been established. So Mindful Money initiated a coalition to support and monitor New Zealand pledges, to encourage more of these pledges from New Zealand fund managers, so that they will commit for our funds that they're managing that they are going to work towards net zero. The best of those funds are saying we'll get to net zero by 2030. which is a really ambitious time frame, and that's consistent with a 1.5-degree pathway. Others are saying, oh, well, it'll take us to 2050. If they don't act immediately, that's not going to be consistent with a 1.5-degree pathway. So we're continuing to monitor what they're doing and hold them accountable. So again, like that spectrum of spectrum of impact, this is how your KiwiSaver fund, for example, can take action. On the left-hand side of the portfolio construction, they can avoid fossil fuel companies. They can avoid high emissions companies like companies that generate electricity from coal. So they can get out of those companies immediately, and that will help reduce their emissions and avoid them investing in companies that are part of the problem. Secondly, they can do active ownership. They can engage with companies across the spectrum to reduce their emissions, using voting on resolutions at annual general meetings, etc. And thirdly, they can invest in solutions, so investing in clean energies or EVs or in carbon sequestration. And those things can be helpful in lowering the emissions of these portfolios. And that's the way, when these funds make a net zero pledge, these are the kind of strategies that they can do to take action on climate change to move towards net zero. So most people say, well, if I'm an investor, if I've got a KiwiSaver fund, is it going to cost me a whole lot to do this? And the answer is not necessarily. So there's been a lot of research to say that if you invest ethically, then the financial returns that you get can be at least as high, or not, if not higher, than the returns that you would get from a conventional fund. And here's an example. This chart, it shows a few things. On the top line, this is the average of the US stock market. The second line is the oil and gas index. And the third line, the red line, is coal. As you can see, the red line has gone rapidly to virtually zero, to say that the value of coal companies has been virtually wiped out over the past 10 years. The yellow line started kind of tracking about the same as the average share market until about 2015. And in 2015, people started understanding that actually the reserves of oil and gas that are at the moment counted as being valuable for these oil and gas companies are going to be worthless, because climate change doesn't allow the world to be able to use all that oil and gas. So the reserves that companies have are not going to have the same value. So the what's called stranded assets. So when action on climate change really starts to ramp up, and that's, as we heard from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change this week, that's got to happen pretty quickly. Then those companies' reserves are going to be worthless, and all of their production infrastructure. So that line for the oil and gas companies, that yellow line, goes down over the period from 2015 to the start of 2020. And as you can see, the average goes up. So if you've been invested in a whole lot of fossil fuel companies, then actually you've had terrible returns. If you've been in a portfolio that doesn't include fossil fuel companies, you've had returns that are far higher. So this is demonstrating that it's not necessarily costly to you to invest in positive action on climate change and to invest ethically. Actually, it often produces far higher returns, as this chart shows. And the second dimension is that this is kind of really important. These scales show how much CO2 we all emit. On the right-hand side, it's all the stuff that you emit through the food you eat, the electricity you buy, your travel through cars, through planes, and all the stuff you buy through shopping. On the left-hand side is the emissions in your KiwiSaver fund, counting an average KiwiSaver fund. So as you can see, there's a huge amount in your KiwiSaver fund that is more than half of all of the rest of your CO2 emissions, all the rest of your carbon emissions. And so what this is saying is that you should really pay attention to the amount of emissions in your KiwiSaver fund, because it's possibly the most significant thing that you can do to reduce your carbon footprint. So I just wanted to finish off and just show you a little bit for mindful money. I'm going to try and okay, so this is working. So this is the website www.mindfulmoney.nz. I'll just show you how to use this as a way to look at funds that you can find. And firstly, we're going to ask the question, what's in my KiwiSaver fund? So click down here under KiwiSaver on Get Started, and then it goes to check a fund. So what I normally do now is kind of ask you what fund you want me to look at, but I'm just going to put one in because that's the biggest fund in New Zealand. So it's the ANZ Growth Fund. And if we click on Go, then we can see, okay, they're invested in, if you use your cursor and hover over the chart, 2.3% in alcohol, 5.9% in animal testing, 2.5% in fossil fuels, etc., in gambling and human rights violations, etc. If we go to the left on the fund details and click on the fund details, you can see all of the companies that they invest in. So there's all the fossil fuel companies, BHP Billiton, down there is Genesis Energy, because they own the Kupe field, etc. OMV wanted to drill in New Zealand, so they're down there. Royal Dutch Shell is down there, etc. So you see a lot of the fossil fuel companies, some gambling, and you can see some of the human rights violation and the companies that test their products on animals. So this is a way that you can then look at the funds that you're invested in, and it's a good way to sort of say, well, am I comfortable with these things that I'm invested in, or is there something that I'd like to look at instead? What you can do is you can put a different fund in here and have a look at a different fund to look at. So what should we look at? Let's look at an ASB fund. So there's an ASB growth fund there. We click on Go, and then you see these two side by side. So it allows you to compare. So that's the Mindful Money tool. And when you're ready, you can find a fund which better meets your criteria. So we're not saying, oh, yes, there's a single standard for what's more ethical. What we're saying is we define some ethical standards, and then we show you the funds that best meet your criteria, because everyone's got their own criteria for what's ethical and what they care about. So what we do is we help by matching you with the funds that meet your criteria, or most closely meet your criteria. And so you can use this in order to find that. There are kind of 3 questions. I won't go through it now. Okay, I'm being told that you can't see my screen. So I'm going to stop sharing. My apologies for that. Gosh. Okay. So I'm sorry you couldn't see that. I thought you could. So I was talking to my colleague just told me. So Olive, do you want to quickly show? So this is what I was talking about on the website. You can click and compare funds. So my colleague's just putting in the ANZ fund, ANZ Growth Fund. She clicks on the button, and what comes up is a chart. So you can put your cursor on the chart and it'll show you what's in each of the segments. So she's hovering over each of those and you can see that. And then if you go to the left-hand side, you can see, click the fund details, you can see all the companies that the fund is invested in. And you can use this to compare. And if you want to then say, well, actually, I want a fund that better meets my ethical wishes, you click on that button on the side as Olive's doing, and you can see the little questionnaire for finding the fund that fits. You can alter the tabs to say, I really care about fossil fuels and weapons and tobacco, maybe not so much about alcohol. And you can play around with these. And then you say what approach is more important to you. You can order those in rankings. And finally, what's your risk profile? And when you do all of that, what comes up is some funds that will help you to be able to see the funds that meet your criteria. So here you've got a Pathfinder Balanced Fund, a Booster Socially Responsible Fund, an AMP Fund, and a Mercer Sustainable Fund. So those are all funds that most closely meet your criteria. So I'm going to take a pause there and say, do you have any questions? And my apologies for that talking where I thought you were seeing my screen, but you weren't. While we're kind of having questions come in, I thought I'd just carry on a little bit about what's happening on investment and climate change. So there are increasingly funds that are investing in climate solutions. So the government has a fund called the Green Investment Finance, and it's got $300 million in it, and they are investing in companies that are basically helping reduce emissions. There's now a new venture capital fund set up to do this, but as yet, there are only a couple of KiwiSaver funds that are doing that. And one of the exciting things is one of those is invested solely in renewable energy. It's a fund called Kernel Clean Energy and one in EVs, Kernel EV Fund. They're both up on the Mindful Money website so that you can go and have a look at that. And when you're there, you can also look at the Take Action on the Climate page, which has got a list of all of the funds that haven't got any fossil fuels in them. So there are no investments in fossil fuel producers. So that's a handy resource for you to look at. And the way we've checked on companies is it's not only that they say they don't have any investments in fossil fuel companies, that actually we've gone right through their portfolio. We've measured it down to 1/100%, and we've verified that they don't have investments in fossil fuel companies. So it's something that you can trust and be confident about. So that's a kind of a handy resource. So if you go on to my colleague Olive's just put it into the chat. So you go on to Mindful Money, invest in climate action. So in fact, actually, I can probably do a quick screen share of that. Just wait 1 second. Here we go. So let me just do a screen share. Hope you're seeing this. So if we go to here, which is get involved, you can also find weapons free fund, stopping animal cruelty. Down here, you've got invest for climate action. So you click on that. I hope you're seeing this. I'm sure my colleague Olive will tell me this time if you're not. Sorry about that. You can see again kind of the arguments for investing in climate action, etc., the different ways that you can reduce emissions in portfolios, and a bit about the Net Zero Coalition. And over here on the left-hand side, you've got the listing of the fossil-free funds. So here, we've also got badges that some funds are using to tell their investors about the fact that they're fossil-free badges. So those are some of the funds. So there's Pathfinder, AMP Capital, and others. And and as you can see then, aside from KiwiSaver funds, there's some investment funds, again, AMP, Booster, Mint, some NZ funds, and again, Pathfinder, Simplicity, and Trust Management. So those are some of the funds that, as I said before, they've not only got a policy to avoid fossil fuel investments, actually they've got the real investments that are verified to meet their policy. So this is a resource for anyone to use. All of Mindful Money's information, by the way, is completely free. We're a charity, and we're doing this primarily in order to let people know that when they invest, they can invest in line with their values. And so it's like a service to help investors be informed about how they're investing. So that was stopping sharing. So please feel free to ask any questions, make any comments. I hope this information has been useful to you. If you are interested in finding out more, again, there's kind of lots of other stuff on our website, including we do weekly seminars. So we have done a lot of seminars on climate change and investing on our website. So go look for the seminar section on our website, and you'll see there the videos and a short write-up of each of the seminars in the series. So we're doing bits of it. So thanks, Elizabeth, who's just put a note in the chat to say she'd use the Mindful Money website, but hadn't seen some bits of it. And yes, there's a whole lot of stuff on the website that you may be interested in seeing. There's also a really good ethical investment guide, primarily steered by Olive, who put together a guide for saying, if you're just kind of starting out on this journey of ethical investing, here are some things that you should know. And it goes through and kind of details really well some of the issues that we're covering in the seminar, but in a little bit more detail than we've been able to cover today. Thanks for your comment, Chelsea. For those of you on the call, we also like kind of spreading the word. So if you find this stuff useful, please tell others. We're as I said, we're a small charity. We've been going for 2.5 years, and we don't have money for huge advertising budgets or anything. And so people hear about us from word of mouth, and it's really been working. Over the last year, we've had a 3-fold increase in people who know who we are and come to our website. So that's all kind of word of mouth, and that's telling people, it's using social media, it's using your networks. What we also do is, if you're in a workplace with other people, we can come in and do a seminar, either face-to-face in some future scenario where we might be able to do that, or online. So we've been to Auckland Council for a couple of sessions. We've been to companies like Ceres Organics and Les Mills and Meridian and so on. So if you're part of a workplace and you want your workmates to be able to hear about how they can invest ethically, and particularly how they can find an ethical KiwiSaver, then please just drop us a note at Mindful Money, and one of us will come and do it. So I'll have just put her email address as contact for that in the chat. So other things we're doing, there are other events where we have going, and again, all of that stuff is on our website. So I think, Olive, is there anything else you want to add? Feel free to jump into the call. And if not, I think we might close off there. So thanks very much for joining us. And we galloped through a whole lot of stuff quickly. So we as I say, we do have a lot of stuff on our website. So it's a good way to explore some of these issues in a bit more depth. Thanks very much to EcoFest West for creating this opportunity for us to talk to you. And I hope you enjoy other events in EcoFest West. And manakitanga kia koutou ka kite anō.